Good evening to you, wherever you are. Perhaps it's good morning, good afternoon. My name's Sukhdev Sandhu. I'm here in New York. I am delighted to be in conversation for the next half hour or so with the great Pat Nevin, footballer, broadcaster, style counselor for people of a certain era, but ongoingly a really eloquent and thoughtful voice around football culture, football cultures. And we're going to be talking about and around his recently published autobiography, The Accidental Footballer. And I thought I'd start, Pat, with the title, The Accidental Footballer. In what way are you accidental?
Well, the sadness of it is, if you don't like my book, blame me, because I've written every word of it, right? So I didn't get it ghosted. However, I can't claim the title because the chap who was looking at the editing afterwards, just checking over it, he came up with the title. But it's very fitting, and I'm really pleased with it, because at no point in my life did I ever plan to be a professional footballer. In fact, one of the lines I tend to use is, I tried very hard not to be a professional footballer and failed, which is an unusual situation, I think, for most professional footballers who have, in the end, what was a 19-year career. But I played football for the pure love and joy of it. And when I was learning as a kid and as a youth player and with my dad, I was just doing it because I loved doing it. I didn't want to particularly go and make a living out of it. In fact, I feared making a living out of it would take the joy away from it, because many jobs happen. That happens in many jobs, and maybe I was quite old for my young years, and I understood that. So I tried hard to. I went in. I started doing a degree. I was doing other things, but the football just kept on grabbing me back in, and eventually I took a chance after turning Chelsea down for an entire year. I said, no, I want to keep on doing my degree, which means it's not a made up line about being an accidental footballer. I tried really hard not to do it as a profession. But I was fortunate, it just kept on going well. And it turned out that accident became a very happy accident for me, because the enjoyable times I had during football as an outsider, and that's maybe one of the joys of this book. There have been many books written by insiders inside football, but I'm very much an outsider who was inside the sport, and it gives you a very different perspective, because things that they all think are normal, I realise the rest of us, and I mean all of us here that are listening, it's weird. And that was one of the great joys of writing the book, that I could hopefully try to bring that out.
Well, we are here, wherever here is, but in this sort of digital sphere, this global sphere, addressing potentially millions of people, hundreds of millions of people in different countries and continents. It all seems very far away, I would imagine, from the sort of perceived sporting audience as it would have looked like in the late 1970s or in the early 1980s. You talked about being an outsider, about being an accidental footballer. What did you imagine the future looked like to you when you were young?
Yeah, when I was younger, I had older brothers and older sisters who were into education. My mum, I came from a very rough part of Glasgow, the east end of Glasgow, and it was a housing scheme, and it was for some time seen as the roughest housing scheme in Western Europe. Now, coming from there, I had mum and dad. There were 6 siblings, and the 6 of us all went on to do higher education. That's very, very unusual for that background, and certainly in that time. So my older brothers and sisters had gone, and they'd got the degrees, and actually all 3 of the older ones went into teaching. One became a headmaster in Scotland, and then moved on to Hong Kong, Singapore, traveled the world, and, it's a fabulously lovely man, my big brother Tommy. My older brother became a headmaster, working as a teacher in a secondary school in Scotland. And my sister became a lecturer in special schools studies. So the idea of me being a footballer just didn't make sense. The sensible thing was to go into a more academic life and then see where that led. So that was the plan as such as there was. And I kept to that plan, even though, early on in my career, I was signed up by Celtic, which is a fantastically huge club. They'd won the European Cup. They seemed very keen on me, but they let me go at 16. But what I didn't tell them was I wouldn't have stayed on had they asked me, because I wanted to do the degree. And that would have been a real shock to them. And that's maybe, when I tell people this now, I'd never really spoken about it a great deal during my career because I was too busy doing other things, just playing football, sharing my loves and enjoying my loves, which is music, the theatre, and the arts. And also, there are a number of things I was involved in, the anti-racism campaign that we started way back in the early 80s in football, which happily grew and became a worldwide phenomenon eventually. But I didn't really talk about my life. And I'll be honest with you, I ended up having a 19-year career. And then another 15, 16, 17 years after that, working in media, before I thought, I should probably write this down. And eventually I got around to it. And it was a joy, because I've been writing for many years, and I've been writing for most of the British newspapers and a lot of different websites recently, etc. And I've been broadcasting for many years, and I put off this writing for a long time. And eventually I just thought I might as well have a go, because I love writing. And it really was quite a surprise that how enjoyable and how easy it came to me. And very much like my football career, the accidental football, I was an accidental author. In fact, I've been an accidental everything, because I wrote the book and told no one. I just wrote it. And then when finished, I said, well, I'll show this to a publisher. And fortunately, they liked it. So it's kind of a very, very unusual way, I think, from the outside of any of the spheres that I've worked in, the way I've come into it. But my attitude has always been, whatever you do, try and do it for the joy and the love of it. And if you do it that way, particularly if it's a creative thing, be it writing, be it play football, be it anything, if you do it for that and not through fear, it tends to work out better.
It reminds me very much of the way you've described writing the book as very close in spirit to DIY culture. Just do it yourself. You write in the book about not having an agent for much of your career, not basically relying on those people out there, but taking ownership, taking responsibility, skilling up. When I was a kid, there was, in my local library, I don't think there were any football books. There were lots of books about cricket. People made lots of claims about why cricket was such a literate sport and all of that stuff. These days, it's sometimes really hard to escape the amount of words around football. What changed, and in what ways was that both useful to you, but also almost a problem, something that you wanted to circumvent? What are the kind of almost the new cliches that have emerged around football writing?
May I say, that's a fabulous question. And the reason being is I came from a different angle. I was interested in literature. So when I was younger, I ate up all the classics, be they French, German, Russian, whatever, English, of course. But I also loved some of the newer writers, and certainly the new journalists were fantastic writers. And some of them wrote about sport. Hunter S. Thompson would sometimes write about sport, and if, all apart from Truman Capote, the rest of them all did have a go at sport, but they didn't attack it as a sports journalist. They looked at it from a different angle, because the sports journalism that we read, we've all read it. We know the phrases, we know how people are saying it, we know the expected journey, we know the norms. I'm bored senseless with all of them. Hence, I'm coming from a completely different angle. And I don't just look at sports journalism. I certainly don't look a great deal at sports journalism when I started my writing. I think writing's just writing, and if you want to get a message across, the idea of the ball rippled against a wet net and I felt great sort of stuff. Yeah, very good, but I've read that before. Who cares? I'm going to tell you other things that you might not have seen. So, I played at Chelsea for a wee period of time, and we had a big blonde centre forward who played for England. And, he's mentioned in the book, and there's the odd story about him, but it's more about his his gambling addiction and the troubles that then became bigger in sport after that. But I spent more time talking about a chap called John McNaught, who only played half a dozen games, but he was a much more interesting story. I love the stories of very unusual people, and still do, within, you know, whatever genre it is, but within that sport, they do pop up. And sometimes the other things, that the clashes that you get. I mean, there is, you may or may not come on to it later, but I had a night out with the singer Morrissey. I spent an evening, and it's an extraordinary story, and it's half a chapter, but it's the strangeness. Now, I could have put lots of other stories about people like that in the book, but it was just to encapsulate that my two different worlds, sometimes 3 or 4 different worlds, now and again they crash together. And it's those crashes that I find interesting, because when that sort of, almost like a collider, you know, like I'm not going to say it's a hadron collider, but when a collider happens, you don't know what's going to splash off. And I was always interested in that in my life, even before I wrote. So that's many of the sort of things that I was going towards. So when people ask me about sports journalism, yes, I'm talking about a sport. I'll be honest with you, I'm not convinced you need to be that into sport to read this book.
I'll ask you about some of the social collisions that are such an entertaining part of the book. But it strikes me that it's a really valuable contribution to the Library of Literature about Glasgow, and especially working class Glasgow, which is itself susceptible to lots of cliches. It's a place. I've just been reading Bobby Gillespie's new memoir. I grew up on all those stories about Gorbals boys doing. It is, in some people's language, or it used to be, almost like a ghetto. And you're very skillful and very sort of canny about how you write about it, and not making it a kind of melodramatic, woebegone kind of place, but a place of striving, of ambition, of kind of quiet but sturdy politics. How important was that kind of background to you, kind of politically?
Massively important. And I'm very happy you mentioned Bobby Gillespie's book, because there is a tradition, and certainly Bobby talks about it in his book. And I would say I've just finished reading the new book by Billy Connolly, the comedian, and he does talk about it as well. And it's this tradition that we have in the East End of Glasgow and many places in the world, where being an autodidact is not a bad thing. You know, if you come from the working class, when I went to football, if they saw me reading a book, they would wind me up, have a laugh at me, and I'm saying, wait a minute, you should be reading too. Where I come from, and in the working class, rough part of Glasgow, that's considered exactly what you should do. And it certainly was a very Glaswegian thing, that self-education and bettering yourself through knowledge was not something to be sneered at, or you were trying to be a snob or better than anyone else. That was just a very much of a Glaswegian tradition. And yes, Bobby was part of that. You'll hear him talking about his political growth in his book. Connolly, if you listen to Billy Connolly, he has read, his favourite book is Brothers Karamazov. Yeah. These are guys that come from a working class background, not always educated, but there's no reason whatsoever that you cannot read. And it doesn't matter what you read, you're learning more about not only the world, but yourself within that. So it was important to me. Oddly enough, it was mostly my teachers, because my dad wasn't a phenomenal reader, my mum wasn't, but they were phenomenally interested in education and making sure we had the best education. And it doesn't really matter where you are. I recently got a tweet, and he'd read my book, this chap had read my book, and he said it so much reminded me of my old childhood. It was fantastic. I remember those days, and I remember what it was like with my parents. And when I grew up in Calcutta, we were just, and I went, what? Glasgow? Calcutta? Why does it remind? But of course it does. Of course it does. There are certain circumstances that are, we are equated throughout the world, and it doesn't matter your language or your culture or many things. There may even be different religions, but there are so many things that you have in common when you are a person who's willing to go on a journey of growth. And certainly that was what the the Glaswegians they were political, yes. We were, of the left, as it would be said there, but we were basically just socially concerned about our fellow man. It was not more complicated than that, even though, obviously we all read all the kind of complicated books in politics. So when you come into the real world and you're older and you see it, at least you've got some ammunition there. And that doesn't half help. That really helps.
Yeah. This isn't your first book, of course. I remember being surprised, when was it? Nearly 20 years ago, when you wrote, or you collaborated with a friend of yours on In My Head, Son, which is, to me, rereading it recently seems really anticipatory. We're much more used, I think, to talking about psychology, about wellness, about depression. Hopefully, we've all become much more aware of just what a lot of stuff is dumped on footballers and young men these days. But you were writing that book in a time, I think, before that kind of public awareness.
I mean, it happens sometimes that you are slightly before your time in certain things, but it shouldn't make any difference. You should be able to speak what you think about as the right things. I mean, it's happened to me quite a few times. I mean, I helped start the anti-racism campaign in English football, and I look at it now, it seems the most obvious thing in the world. But back then, nobody else thought it was a sensible thing to even talk about. And I'm sitting there thinking, what? Of course you must talk about this. And then you go on much later in my career, and I was very interested in the psychology that anyone was having to deal with, whether it be sports or anything. But the psychology within, certainly within the area that I was working in, I was very intrigued by. I'd studied a bit of psychology myself. So I wanted to, dig down quite deep inside that. To be honest, in retrospect, I find the book a bit earnest, that original one. And I wasn't, although I was kind of happy when it was done, I have to say, it wasn't me. I wanted to put a book out that was me. This recent one is very much me. And I use a word that I never use, and I really never use this word, but I've used it about this book. I'm proud of it because it actually does. And that's a big word for me to say because it sounds egotistical, and I'm not egotistical. But you actually get who you are as a person, and I hope that comes across. I feel it does come across. So the psychological stuff's still in there, but it's hidden within humor. It's hidden within stories. It's almost creeping quietly into your head without you knowing it, and that's how I prefer it. And certainly, when I often say to a lot of people, you can read great philosophers, and I've read enough myself, and I don't know how much I've learned, but I've read enough. But I think I've learned as much about philosophy from Monty Python than I have from anything else, or possibly Douglas Adams, who's a great writer in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But if you read that in different ways, you will find great things out about humanity. So certainly in the past, these are things I've been interested in, but it may well be that, as I'm writing just now, it's not frivolous, but it's probably a wee bit more fun to read.
I'm still baffled, I was baffled while reading the book, and I'm still baffled and bemused to imagine you coming down to London, early-ish to mid 1980s. What is it? 180 quid is your salary. 100 quid of that goes on not a ratty, but not the most gilded of digs. Yeah. And yet what might seem like a period of austerity, of privation, compared to, I don't know, Winston Bogart earning millions of quid for doing nothing and seemingly being quite content with that. You make it seem a kind of quietly really romantic period of your formation, and also more broadly of just being young and alive to the possibilities of cultural awakening in a big city.
You can approach life in many ways, but if you can possibly be positive, and I know it isn't possible for absolutely everyone because the world's a hard place, but I found myself in a city like London, which is a fabulous city. I had just about enough money to get by. I was doing a job that I enjoyed doing. Anything beyond that, I thought it was a fabulous bonus. And I was learning. I began very quickly to meet interesting people. And there was no way that I could see that in a negative way. Now, to be fair, I just happen to be one of these people that has got a positive outlook in life. I often say to people, what does happiness mean? Because all the money in the world you want, I'd dump it all for happiness, and it sounds the most trite, simple thing to say, but I understand it's absolutely true. If you give someone a 20-room mansion with a big swimming pool and, waiters serving on them and the best food in the world, but there isn't any love, would you swap that for a 1-bedroom flat somewhere with the person you loved? And it's simple. It's a simple answer. Problem is, not everyone gets the answer right through their lives. But I've never had a problem with that. I've always understood what was for me the important things. Now, it's very fortunate that I've never had a real interest in, baubles and owning things and wealth. They don't interest me, but seeing things, doing things, learning things always has. And they don't always cost a huge amount of money. So I've understood that from a very, very young age. I was probably a wee bit too earnest with it when I was younger. In fact, I'll be honest with you just now, and I'll tell the listeners, I almost called the book The Importance of Not Being Earnest, because I was so earnest when I was younger. But I had to lighten up a little bit. But I've always understood and followed and chased the important things in life, which are being with people you like, being happy when you can, and not chasing after frivolous things that in the end will never give you happiness. You can have a watch that costs £9.99 and a watch that can cost £20,000. They both tell you at the time. That's my attitude.
Well, I vaguely remember that period, and I remember it wasn't just about finding things that you like, but there was a sense that this was in various ways an expression of a kind of sort of politics, of a kind of sort of group identity. And the world was looking pretty tough. It seemed that it might be destroyed at any time by careless or reckless politicians. That seriousness itself wasn't something to be looked down upon. And a lot of and if that was pretentiousness, well, so be it. Pretentiousness can be its own reward. Can you tell, it's going to be in a couple of years, nearly 20 years since John Peel has died. And for many people, he is one of the kind of architects of post-war Britain, and who defined and kind of extended our cultural imaginations in ways that sometimes we're still living through. You, at the time that you were kind of gracing Stamford Bridge, were working for free for John Peel late in the evening. Could you say who he was and kind of why he's also a big figure in The Accidental Footballer?
Well, he is a big figure because he was, before I went to London, I'd never met John Peel. I used to listen to his radio show every night. And he promoted young, interesting, unusual bands that, in the end, almost any great musician stroke band who has got a soul came through John Peel's show. And he discovered a vast, vast number of them. And he was the first person to bring them to the populace. And those of us who love music, we would listen to him, absolutely religiously every night. And all through my late teens, I would do that. And when I sang for Chelsea going down in the train, if I had one dream that I had, it wasn't scoring a diving header against Arsenal for Chelsea down at Stamford Bridge, although I did do that in the end. It was, I might meet John Peel at a gig one night and I might say hello. Anyway, I eventually, when I went down and after a while, a meeting was arranged by myself because I was interviewing for a magazine that I was writing for at the time. And we met up and we immediately became great friends. There was reasons for it. We had a number of things in common. He loved football. I loved football. He loved music. I loved music. But we were both very much outsiders in our own industries. But we were also in those industries because we loved those industries, not because we wanted to make money, not because we wanted to be famous. In fact, the fame and celebrity thing, we were both very, very wary of. And John and I have stayed that way all our lives. So I would go in and meet up with John after a few months of knowing him. He would just say, "Do you want to come into the show tonight?" So they were doing the show, and sometimes it'd be going out in the World Service. Usually it was going out in Radio 1 at night. And he would play his latest Belgian madness or something from Eastern Europe that was mad noise, or something German, or something from anywhere in the world, or some great new punky band. And I would write down all the notes so that they could get paid their 50p or whatever it was, these artists, because you had to write down the notes so they wouldn't get paid. But the joy was just being with John and talking about life, talking about people, talking about music, talking about football, talking about anything. And we just had so much in common. And that kept on all the way through our lives. And there was a moment, a wonderful moment, when I left Chelsea and went to Everton. And we got to the FA Cup final. And I'm playing for Everton against Liverpool. And John's a Liverpool fan. And I'll get him tickets for the game. And he turned up head to toe in red. I said, "I got you tickets. I'm blue. I'm Everton." But he was a red, and he sat in the Everton end, head to toe red. And because he was John Peel, everyone loved him, was kind to him. But it was an honour to know him. And strangely enough, asking me that question, someone followed me on Twitter just a few weeks ago, and I noticed the name, and it was a girl I had gone to school with, and she was a big music fan at the time. At school, there was 4 or 5 of us who quite liked music, but she really knew her stuff. And she'd never found out that I became great friends with John Peel. So 35 or 40 years down the line, she said, "I can't believe you became friends with him." And that's what I felt. And it never went away. And oddly enough, without confusing things too much, I'm 20 pages short of the final edit in part 2 of this, of my memoir. So it's just about to be sent. I'll send it to the publishers tomorrow afternoon. And there are many more John Peel stories in the second one. And one of the sadnesses is an incredible story, which John asked me to his party, his 65th birthday party, many years later. And I said to my wife, "I have to be there." And she said, "Are you mad? He lives in Suffolk, and I'm in Scotland." There was no way I could get there because, I had to be back in Scotland and that next morning, and I had to leave in the morning. And I said, "I don't know why I have to be there." So I ended up getting this flight. I got a guy to drive me about 150 miles to John's party. The John's party was fabulous. There was some wonderful people there, Delia Smith and Jarvis Cocker, and wonderful, lovely time. John was delightful because he wasn't as nervous that night. At 12 o'clock, I got back in that car, got to the airport. 2.5 hours later, I was on a flight at 6 a.m., flew home, and the next morning I was in for work. I'd had no sleep, and I've never done anything like it in my life before. John was dead 2 weeks later. I have never known why I did that. I have never known why I took this extraordinary madcap thing, which is not my style at all. But I'd said to my wife before, "I don't know why I must be there." And I did go. And it was, I'm not actually the most spiritual person. But it was an extraordinary thing that, in all the things I've done in my life, I'm so happy I did that thing that day. So the stories and the things we had and the gigs we went to, they were lovely, and they're all fabulously memorable. And maybe that was one of the great things about being the accidental outsider footballer, is that I would meet people like that. I would be friends with people like that. I got on well with the footballers. They were fine, but they weren't my friends. They were colleagues that I liked. And people say to me, "Isn't that strange?" And I always say to them, "Well, who are your friends? Are they your work colleagues or are they your friends?" And everyone's the same, aren't they? Most of our friends are not our work colleagues. They're people we know and we like, and some of them are friends. So it was lovely to be able to share some of the stories about John, but all the way peppered through that book, one of the lovely things is to be able to tell stories about people that you liked that other people didn't know. There's a footballer called Graham Lasso, And there's a lot of stuff about Graham. I mean, Graham went through a lot of stuff at the time. It was very, very tough for him what he was going through, because he found it hard to cope with. He was, a lot of the fans were calling him gay. He happened not to be gay, but it really upset him. And I was saying to him, look, why are you're dealing with them the way they're dealing with you? You're morally above them. Just say, I'm not gay, but if I was, so what? That's. But it was easy for me to say. But I have to say, it was lovely to be able to mesh all these things together and have some, not pulpit messages there, but certainly some message to say, look, there's a nice way to live life, and do you know what it is? Kind of be nice to each other. Kind of works. It's not. Sometimes we can get a wee bit overcomplicated about that. So it was all those things, trying to, and the actual structure of writing about, as you well know yourself, is not always simple. And I'd found a couple of things that as been writing over the years. But one of the things, if I could give this little trick away, and I'll be honest about it, I'd read a book about 4 or 5 years ago, and it was a book by a chap called Adam Kay. You might have come across it. And he was a young doctor, and it's called This Is Going to Hurt. Now, apart from being fabulously funny and very irreverent, the genius of it was he had these incredibly long notes at the bottom of pages. So we Scots and the Gaelic people, the Gaelic people like the Irish, we tell a story, and then you've probably noticed, and then we go to something else, and then we come back. Billy Connolly does it a lot. But I was trying to figure out a way to do this so that the structure still worked. And I read Adam Kay's book, and I went, that's it. You just do these big, long notes, which are encapsulated stories on their own. So I actually loved doing it that way, because it lightened the whole thing and made the structure feel exactly the way I wanted it to feel. I'll tell you a story, and then I'll tell you this little one, and then we'll come back to the story again. And I loved doing it.
Yeah, you're talking about, but this is my final question, because we're pretty much out of time. But you talk about traveling to China. You talk about the efforts you went into to kind of maximize your trips abroad. You met Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Have you been to? I'm curious. Have you been to India? And do you have a sense of football's status in India today?
I'm absolutely devastated that I've not got to India yet, or any places generally subcontinent area. My traveling mostly has been with my job. So I get to go to Korea and Hong Kong and America and every country in Europe, and, as you say, Middle East. I've traveled, so Georgia, you name it, China, Japan. But India, while I was doing football, while I was covering it, and while I'm currently covering it, I've not been sent there. It is one of the big misses of my life, because my brother Tommy spent a good deal of time in India, and he just says, you will love it. And I know I will. My wife and I have decided that our next port of call, when we get a chance to travel again, will be Nepal. So, and we're going there just purely for a holiday. But the chance to spend time in India is, I'm absolutely desperate. I'm a fanatical traveler, and I would love the opportunity to really discover India. Problem is, you can't do India in 2 weeks. If you really want to see the country, you need. And I've read so much about India. I've spent so much time watching various television programs. Culturally, it is the most extraordinarily interesting place. So before I go, I'll get there. I'm absolutely convinced of it.
Anybody watching this, drop Pat an email. he's all ears.
Can I tell you one thing just before you go? There is a Chelsea supporters club in India. In fact, there's more than one. See if they ever ask me to go across to do a speech, I'll go. I just need that excuse. So that would be a joy. But can I, just before we go, can I just say, I'm happy you asked me that one, because I've mentioned the fact that I've written this other book. It's actually part of a trilogy. The third book is a travel book, purely a travel book, because after I stopped playing football, I basically traveled the world as a correspondent for football, and I did exactly the same as I did during my football career. I went out and explored and learned about the cultures that I spent time in. So, and the adventures I had there. So if I'm spared, next year I'll be sitting down to write that as well. So I love the writing, and the thing I say to most people, and I think I'm in the right place to say it here, it doesn't matter if you buy my book or listen to it in Audible, which I read, and hopefully you can understand me. Read anything. Just read. You will learn more about yourself. You will learn more about other people in the world. And it is the biggest joy, along with music, that I've had in my life. So it's something to do and something to keep on doing.
Pat Nevin, thank you ever so much.
It's a pleasure.